I thought we were both going to get a breathing space, but we don't. Anyway, there we are. Buckle up. Ladies and gentlemen, well, it's still there. The entry of the partisans in Zagreb on that 8th of May 1945 certainly wasn't regarded as a step towards liberation by the tens of thousands of people who fled before them. Although the independent state of Croatia, the NDH authorities, certainly did seek to encourage, in order to promote their importance with the Allies, this mass exodus, from Zagreb and from elsewhere in Croatia on 6th and 7th of May was, for the most part, spontaneous. And the common factor was fear of partisan revenge alongside a misguided hope that the West, especially the British, would offer refuge. Archbishop Stepinac later in Križni recalled the scenes, and I'll quote him. "I saw," he said, "those poor people advancing out of Bosnia, Srijem, Slavonia, in long columns. An old horse pitifully pulling a cart, women and children on carts, cows tied behind the carts and such sights. Where was that poor crowd off to? They would kill them, those that did not die on the way." These people rightly assessed that the future for them and their families did not involve liberation. It's worth adding that although the conditions and timing were different, those Serbs who were regarded as a threat to the new order received similar treatment before and after the partisans were transported into Belgrade, let's remember, on Red Army tanks. The communist secret police there in Serbia had more time to prepare detailed lists of those marked out for liquidation. Moreover, it was easier to carry out their plans because the victims had not fled. These lists and reports, unlike in Croatia, have largely survived, and what they show, we can assume, applied throughout Yugoslavia. Of course, we must be fair, a limited number of people were indeed liberated, such as those held in NDH, independent state of Croatia, prisons and camps. The Zagreb Jews were, for the most part, sadly not among these, because they had been dispatched to Auschwitz for liquidation on Himmler's instructions in 1943. Only those married to Gentiles, that is Christians, had been spared, mainly because of Stepinac's and the church's interventions. Nor did the Jews, those who survived inside the country and those who returned to it, nor did they find it easy. Indeed, it was often very dangerous to seek restitution of their property from the new authorities. The other sense of the word liberation, and the party deliberately now and later confused the two to burnish its patriotic credentials, the other sense of the word liberation was the removal of control by the Axis occupiers of significant stretches of Croatian territory. Croatia within socialist Yugoslavia expanded into Istria and obtained Rijeka, Zadar, some of the islands, Baranja and Međimurje. Of course, what happened to the national minorities in those areas, Italians, Hungarians and Germans, hardly amounted to liberation, did it? But rather expulsion, imprisonment, persecution and often death. And we shall hear about that from two of our speakers later. The entry of those partisans into Zagreb on 8th of May had been meticulously prepared. The detailed plan for taking Varaždin, drawn up at the end of March 1945, undoubtedly had its equivalent, now lost, for Zagreb. It listed all the important buildings and institutions to be secured, and most important, those who were to be arrested. The methods practiced by the Yugoslav secret police were based upon those in the Soviet Union. Agents were, that's Yugoslav agents, were now and later trained on the ground and attended special schools run by the Soviet military mission and NKGB officers. As in other countries where the Communist Party was struggling for power, the secret police in Yugoslavia was a party military offshoot. Only party members now and later could join it. The OZNA, Odjeljenje za zaštitu naroda, Department for the Protection of the People, was established by Tito in May 1944. It was headed at state level by Aleksandar Ranković and for Croatia by Ivan Krajačić Stevo. The first, second and third sections of OZNA carried out operations, while the fourth section was dedicated to data collection and organization. This was regarded as a task of great importance. Comprehensive lists were drawn up of enemies of the people who should be liquidated or imprisoned when the partisans entered any town or city. In 1946, after the establishment of a party-controlled government, and as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the secret police had a crucial role in securing the new order by terror. The work of OZNA was now split between the newly formed UDBA, Uprava državne bezbednosti, Administration of State Security, and the KOS, Kontraobavještajna služba, the counterintelligence service of the Yugoslav army. Then in 1966, after the fall of Ranković, the internal secret police intelligence services were transferred to the level of the republics, while a federal body exercised supervision. In Croatia, the secret police became the SDS, Služba državne sigurnosti, State Security Service, though it was still referred to as the UDBA and its operatives as Udbashi. Despite rivalries, the intelligence services in the army, the foreign service, and at the federal and republic levels, and there were 13 altogether, worked in cooperation to liquidate and persecute opponents of the regime at home and abroad. Yugoslavia can therefore, like other communist countries, accurately be described as a police state. Igor Omerza will discuss the secret police in Slovenia, and Bože Vukušić will describe the assassinations abroad. It's important to emphasize just how far-reaching this system was. The personnel files of agents of OZNA, UDBA and SDS, and of their collaborators, suradnici, and operational contacts, operativne vezove, are either destroyed or hidden. But the networks involved clearly embraced huge numbers of people, pressured or tainted or rewarded by the authorities for spying on their neighbors. This is one more poisonous consequence of communism. How many were killed in those early days will probably never be fully established. In Croatia, a commission for the determination of wartime and post-war victims was set up under Vice Vukojević in 1991. But Croatia's homeland war delayed its work, and it was closed for political reasons in 2002, with its work only partly done. A commission set up for the same purpose in Serbia, which operated between 2009 and 2014, already found a problem from lack of surviving witnesses, though it identified more than 55,000 victims. And there is now talk of setting up a new Croatian commission. This is going to happen, I think. All I would say is that if the proposal is serious, the work will be hard. If it is not serious, it will of course be easy, because nothing will be done. In any case, enough is known already about the contents of mass graves in Slovenia and some in Croatia to show the scale of what the partisans did, and Mitja Ferenc and Amir Opojaš will be speaking about that. The prisons and camps in and around Zagreb, Kanal, Jankomir, Prečko, Maksimir, Sesvete, temporarily in 1945 held enemies of the people who were taken out of them for, at best, summary trial and execution and burial, or moved along the Križni way of the cross, forced marches. The proceedings in Zagreb were initially not harsh enough for Ranković, who on the 15th of May addressed a severe rebuke to Krajačić, and the telegram reads, "Your work in Zagreb is unsatisfactory. In 10 days in liberated Zagreb, only 200 bandits were shot. We are astonished at this indecisiveness in purging Zagreb of villains." In the days that followed, the industrial scale of killing should have started to satisfy even Ranković. An authoritative list has been published of those who were executed in Zagreb in 1945 and 1946, and there are 1,555 names on it. Some are well known, a few notorious, but most of the victims are now forgotten. Some categorizations are revealing of the party's intentions. Thus, 60 were executed before any sentence was passed, which illustrates the new ruler's haste and lack of interest in justice. 35 of the victims were priests, nuns, and other religious functionaries, because religion was to be singled out for persecution. 94 of those sentenced to death were women. Many other women endured long sentences under barbaric conditions in Požega women's prison and elsewhere. Thus did communism liberate women. And I'll return to the subject of prisons in a minute. The partisans had made a series of promises before they gained power which foretold the birth of freedom, a genuine liberation. These were flagrant lies that no one in the party leadership, at any rate, had any intention of honouring, and which were primarily directed at the Allies. At its third meeting at Topusko on the 9th of May 1944, Zavnoh, the country anti-fascist council of the National Liberation of Croatia, that is, the kernel of the future People's Republic of Croatia, issued what it called a Declaration on the Fundamental Rights of the People and Citizens of Democratic Croatia. And among its pledges were as follows, and I quote, "To every citizen is guaranteed the security of the person and property. The right of ownership and private initiative in economic life are guaranteed. To all citizens are guaranteed freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. To all citizens are guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of contract, and freedom of association. And finally, voters in democratic Croatia exercise their right to vote by secret ballot on the basis of general, equal, and direct voting rights." End of quotation. I want briefly to examine how each of these 5 pledges was violated. First, there was no security of the person because there was no rule of law. Initially, executions were often conducted without any judicial process. Retrospective sentencing by a military court was as likely as not a means simply of ensuring that confiscation of the condemned person's property could succeed. When civilian courts took over judging civilians, previously the military courts had done it, the OZNA and UDBA still had a large role. The defence laboured under great disadvantages, and the prosecution was effectively all-powerful. Many trials were secret. Others, by contrast, were turned into show trials with a political purpose. The suffering of those consigned to long periods of imprisonment, and there is a very large volume of material on this written by survivors, is, I must confess, difficult to read, as I have been reading it, let alone describe with equanimity. Torture methods employed included beating with fists, boots, and clubs, suspending people by their arms and beating their feet till they were rendered unconscious, forcing wedges under the fingernails, electric shocks applied to the genitalia, solitary confinement for months on end in icy, unheated cells, consignment to tiny punishment cells, really just holes in the wall, entirely without light, where you could neither sit nor stand. Psychological pressure by all-night interrogations. Use of paid informers and provocateurs to trick people into punishable indiscretion and those unbearable work routines. These included, for women from the Požega prison, back-breaking work on draining the Lonjsko Polje marshes and building what seems to me the ironically named Brotherhood and Unity motorway. The worst Yugoslav prison was in Stara Gradiška in Croatia, and there are many Croats alive now who have served periods in there. In Stara Gradiška, a succession of political prisoners was maltreated from the end of the war up till the fall of the communist regime. The staff were nearly all Serbs, chosen because they were more likely to enjoy abusing the Croats and later Albanians sent there. Now, all prisons are unpleasant. Many are dangerous and disgusting. But Yugoslavia's prisons accurately represented in microcosm the totalitarian system on which Tito's state was based. Which brings us to the second violation of rights. Private ownership and private business were not respected. The confiscation of property quickly proceeded, partly through outright seizure of private flats, but more systematically by application of the 24th of April 1945 decision of the presidency of Zagreb about the protection of the national honor of Croats and Serbs in Croatia. And this provision set up special courts applying a very wide definition of collaboration with the enemy as a device quickly to seize businesses and property. Spurious war guilt was used to effect nationalization without compensation. Third, there was no respect of conscience or the right to worship. Priests were killed or imprisoned, usually at Stara Gradiška. The church was subject to marginalization, confiscation, repression, and infiltration. A bitter ideological war against Christianity was fought in the classrooms and among the country's youth, and Jure Križni will later tell us more about all this. Fourth, any exercise of the right to free speech could quickly result in imprisonment. Verbal crime, verbalni delict, applied to the most minor transgressions. If someone informed on you, you could be sentenced to a long period of confinement and hard labor. Years after Tito's death, it was made a criminal offense to detract from his reputation. The party controlled the newspapers and electronic media. Public gatherings without government approval were impossible. Trade unions acted as tools of the state in implementing the 5-year plan. They were not there to protect the rights of workers. Fifth, there was no sincere attempt to install democracy. The creation of a one-party state was achieved by splitting and intimidating the Croatian Peasants' Party, the HSS. Which was the only important alternative to the communists, and then creating the conditions in which it was unable to campaign. The agreement between Tito and the head of the Peasants' Party and Prime Minister of the royal government in exile, Ivan Šubašić, was broken. Many of those Peasants' Party leaders were later imprisoned, and the same fate befell the opposition leaders, we should remember, in Serbia and Slovenia, itself mirroring the treatment of peasant parties elsewhere in Europe by the communists. Despite so much evidence, there's still a widespread perception in the West that in Tito's Yugoslavia, the regime was more benign than regimes in the rest of the socialist world. Tito still finds an appreciative audience of not very useful fools. A recent historian of Yugoslavia writes of the Marshal being regarded as, I quote, the beloved father of the nation, end of quote, and as, I quote, mentor of the common folk in their struggle with the bureaucracy, end of quote, and of how, wait for this, From Tito's popularity radiated the nimbus of greater democratic consent, whatever that means. The breathless admiration is unmistakable, and Mario Jareb is going to talk about some of this. Tito's Yugoslavia remained a totalitarian state. Such a system, wherever implemented and at whatever juncture, is not completely successful. The precise tools it uses vary somewhat according to real and perceived threats. The cadres will change over time, sometimes by purges, usually by natural processes, though the change is characteristically less than in an open system. Resistance will vary too in its form and scale according to domestic and foreign conditions. The effects of peace, relative prosperity, and in Yugoslavia's case, Western influence, alongside, let us never forget, the courage of the dissidents, were such that Yugoslavia and Croatia by the 1980s were clearly different in many ways from what they were in the late 1940s. Yet neither externally imposed pressures nor sharing in the general advance of European living standards changed the nature of the system itself, as defined by its purposes, its interests, and the means it applied to enforce its domination. The Communist Party from 1952, called the League of Communists of Croatia, finally accepted a multi-party system and adopted a cumbersome new name, Party of Democratic Changes, Social Democratic Party, but only when it was forced to do so. Communism in Yugoslavia fell not through reform, but just as it had arrived, through revolution. That second revolution was soon, however, submerged in a war for national independence, and indeed, in Croatia's case, national survival. The process of transformation was paused, and this is only one reason why so much of the old system still survives, and why we are supposed to keep quiet about it. Thank you.